which is the following. Here we are, 100 days tomorrow. Wow. Yep. So about 12 years ago, I was here in Washington, and I had been invited to attend an event, a speaking event, and there was an assigned table. I found myself at this table. Nobody else was sitting there, and then before long, John McCain came and sat down. And it was this iconic figure, John McCain, Senator John McCain. And then 2 or 3 other guests who had seats there came and filled up the table. And there was 1 seat left, and right next to Senator McCain. And eventually the missing person showed up, and it was Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. And when she arrived, he stood up with this look of delight, hugged, and they kissed, and they sat down and fell into a close, warm conversation. And I don't really remember anything else about the event that night, but I do remember that. And I left the event that evening feeling better about America, better about myself, better about our chances to overcome differences. And I've often thought of it as a kind of shining example of the spirit of American public life, of American public service. So I wanted to remind us about that kind of bipartisanship today. So we were still involved in these wars in the Middle East at the time, which is why it felt important. This was a feeling, I had a troubled feeling that I've often carried with me when I came back to the United States. I'm the son of a foreign service officer, and I grew up abroad. I grew up in about 8 or 9 countries, and my father worked for both USAID, the soon-to-be late lamented, I guess, and the Peace Corps as well. And wherever we lived, my father would point out, in fact, involve us to a great degree in the local cultural landscape and the poverty in many of the countries we lived in. And he would proudly talk about the work he was doing, that the US was doing in these countries on behalf of the people, the neediest people there. And he would talk about how America was wealthy and had a civic spirit, and that it was important that we share some of that with the rest of the world. When we eventually returned to the US, I could see that, my father's sometimes rosy depiction of the country we came from, this is the greatest country in the world, son, didn't always match up to the description. And it was clear that this was a country with problems of its own, racism, its own poverty, and of course its involvement in foreign wars, Vietnam at the time. But my father, as an active foreign service officer, opposed some of the policies that the government still held on to, and often took us, along with my mother, all of us kids, to the marches in Washington, Poor People's Campaign, the anti-war rallies. My earliest memories of American public life are those demonstrations. And I think now on that, how he had no fear of reprisal, despite the fact that he was a career foreign service officer, in expressing his opposition. And he used to reassure me that, that this country, despite its problems, had a collective spirit and a force within it that would help us ameliorate and overcome those problems. In the years since then, US progress towards a fairer society has sometimes felt like a mixed bag, as governments as different in form and style as those of the Carter, Reagan, Clinton, and the Bush administrations came and went, and finally Obama too. But after seeing McCain and Pelosi together that night, I did go away feeling better about America and more optimistic. What a different place our country feels like today. A couple of days ago, over 200 former American diplomats and national security officials signed their names to an open letter entitled "The Assault on American Democracy, a Call to Action." And I quote, "As American diplomats around the world and national security leaders here at home, we saw no greater cause than serving our fellow citizens. We swore to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. None of us thought the second part of that phrase would ever come into play until now. American global leadership has depended on many factors, including political, economic, and military power. But most important was the moral foundation for that power. America as an example to others. Though our actions didn't always live up to our ideals, we stood for simple but powerful ideas. that were everywhere embraced: democracy, equality, individual liberty, and human rights. That moral foundation is now in grave danger. The challenge comes from within, as President Trump and his administration have assaulted the pillars of our democracy here at home and our strength around the world. The letter goes on to list the many ways that Trump has undermined our democracy. No need to repeat them all here. And to say, American democracy and security are inextricably linked. Weaken one, and the other inevitably begins to fail. As patriots and public servants from both parties who worked to protect America over many decades, we see that link unraveling at lightning speed. Many of us have served in countries where democratically elected leaders followed a path to democracy, to autocracy, and we know this crisis requires an urgent and unified response. No American should be silent. No American who cares about our freedoms, institutions, and our identity as a nation can afford to be a bystander. Each of us in different walks of life must do what we can. Speak out, mobilize, defend our way of life. The moment requires nothing less. We must recognize the seriousness of what is taking place and act collectively to restore our democracy and our security. If we do not, the American ideals of liberty, prosperity, and equality will quickly become relics of the past. This is truly an extraordinary document, and one that I believe is unprecedented in American public life. And four of its signatories, Maria Yovanovitch, Harry Thomas, Eric Rubin, and John Feeley, are here with us today. What they also have in common is that they are all former career US Foreign Service officials, all served the US government for over 30 years, all served as US ambassadors in countries abroad, and all of them worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations. All of them have also personally witnessed how other countries, democracies at the time they knew them, slid into dictatorship. And they're here to share those experiences in the hopes that what they saw and learned in foreign lands might be instructive for Americans here at home now. And help me welcome them by giving them a hand. And one last little bit before we hear from them. I want to start by saying in our conversations over the last few days that you've told me you believe there's a kind of universal autocrat's playbook, one in which would-be tyrants seem to follow a striking similar path to consolidate autocracy and dictatorship. And I'm just going to name them here because they're going to be our conversation points in this talk. Win election through democratic means, then use the instruments of governance to eliminate constraints on executive power, remove sources of opposition, and foment fear and confusion amongst the population. Attack free media and propagate lies and disinformation that sow confusion and cynicism. Victimize the vulnerable and create a feared other with a culture of violent rhetorical denunciation that leads to physical intimidation by irregular forces loyal to the autocrat. Exaggerate concepts of national pride, historic revival, and exclusionary patriotism. Inject self-dealing and corruption with feudal-like oligarchs and inbred familial nepotism that leads to economic state capture. Politicize the judicial system, the military, and the federal bureaucracy. Attack or disappear opposition leaders or critics with no due process or respect for the law. Consolidate power in the legislature and local governments and drive towards a one-party system. And finally, modify the Constitution to expand executive power and eliminate term limits. I don't know, does any of that sound familiar to any of you guys? So, I'm going to start with Eric Rubin. Has a long and variegated career, much of it in the East, in Russia. You served in Russia and dealing with that country in the Soviet Union as it fell apart and became the Russia we know today. You were there at the time of the handover by Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin. What similarities do you see between the way Trump is seeking to consolidate power here with what Putin did 25 years ago? From our bullet points here, from the autocrat's playbill, which seem most applicable? Is it the feared other, in which Trump has vilified migrants as murderers and thieves, freeloaders, or Democrats as lunatic socialists? Or is it the part about state capture by cronies and oligarchs? Please, thank you.
Thank you, Jon Lee. And my easy answer is yes. All of the above. Let me just say, I know a lot of the people here. It's so great to see so many old friends and colleagues, journalist friends, others. In terms of my background, I share a lot of similarities with Jon Lee, coming from a very patriotic family that was also a family that believed in protest and believed in speaking up. And my mother marched in the March on Washington in 1963 with Dr. King as a representative of the New York Urban League. I was taken to Vietnam War moratorium marches when I was 12 and 13 years old. I still remember the black armbands, and I was taught that patriotism means standing up for what you believe in for our country, not blindly obeying and following what you're told to do. So that carried me through 38 years in the Foreign Service, and I feel very strongly about it, and I'm afraid we may be losing it in a lot of ways. So my piece is to talk about Russia. I have an association with Russia going back to 1977, when I first studied Russian in public high school on a DoD Title VIII National Defense Education Act grant, which in those days we did things like pay students to study foreign languages. I wish we were paying students to study Chinese today, among other things, but we're not. But it goes back to then. It goes back to 1974, when I first went to the Soviet Union with my parents, and then all through the 80s and 90s and into my career. It was a very close association. And I think the most important point I would make is we did suffer from what I would call excessive, maybe naive optimism, but there was a lot of reason for optimism and hope when the Soviet Union began to fall apart and when the Cold War ended. And things kind of were breaking our way. And looking back at that time, I think there was just an assumption that things would continue to go the right way, that democracy, free market economics and electoral democracy would be the only game in town. And I think people forget, looking at Russia today, just how free and democratic the Soviet Union became in only a few years. And Gorbachev deserves credit for that. Boris Yeltsin deserves credit for that. But, you know, if you look at the last days of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev and then the first days of the independent Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin, they had absolute freedom of speech, freedom of press and the media, freedom of religion, free elections, freedom of labor rights, of unions to organize. I could keep on going. I mean, it was not perfect, but it's not perfect here.
And I'm gonna ask you, now that you've begun with that, it's a really interesting scene setter, I think, for what came next. So let's return to that. Let's return to what happened when
Sure.
Putin came along. And yeah, so that was lots of promise, lots of flaws, but a functional democracy of sorts.
Yes, of real sorts, I would say, not perfect. And what happened basically was a takeover. And the parallels, since that's what we're talking about today, to what we're dealing with now are very real, very direct, and almost across the board, what we're seeing now. So what happened when the KGB took over in Russia in 1999? First thing to go was freedom of the press and freedom of media. And it did not mean censorship right away. What it meant right away was pressure, intimidation, lawsuits, an effort to scare the media into behaving and not criticizing the people in power. A direct parallel to what's going on now with CBS, ABC, CNN, direct parallel. It took a few years for actually the government to really take over the media, but initially that was the playbook, and that is exactly what I see happening here. The second thing.
Let me go on to Harry, and we'll go back to Russia and how the other ways in which Putin began to consolidate his tyranny. This is the only thing to call it that. Harry, you've been an ambassador in the Philippines, in Bangladesh, and again, like everyone here, a really long and storied career. And you were also ambassador to Zimbabwe, which, you know, for those of us who recall the story, you know, after the really brutal National Liberation War against white minority rule, had an election in which Robert Mugabe, one of the leaders of that struggle, became the democratically elected leader of Zimbabwe. And for about 10 years, with some ructions along the way, it functioned as such. And then in 2000, things began to change. I mean, you tell us what you believe happened there. And if, again, there's parallels with what we're beginning to see here. Are there examples from Zimbabwe and what Mugabe did that seem applicable?
Well, yes, thank you. Yes, I do see the parallels. I served in Zimbabwe twice. And initially, as you said, Mugabe inherited a country which was a democracy, protected minority rule, had a free press, an independent judiciary, independent university system. And over 20 years, especially as he started to lose power and prestige and popularity, he got control of all of them. Made it a one-party state by murder of minorities, appointed himself chancellor of the University of Zimbabwe, then put all of his cronies in as directors, made sure his second wife got a PhD in 90 days.
We'll have to see if Melania is studying anywhere at the moment.
As Ambassador Nichols knows. At the same time, took over newspapers, media, firebombed radio stations, TV stations who would not go along with his intimidation, caused them to close, led to flight of the intellectuals. At independence, 4,000 Zimbabweans returned from the United States who had been educated by the American people. Zimbabwe is the home of the Rhodes Scholarship. Several Zimbabweans who work here now had to leave. And then the imperfect part of their democracy was that Rhodesian farmers, mostly white, controlled 4,000 farms. As Mugabe's popularity started to go down, he used this nationalism. We're going to take back the farms, and which he did. But did he give them to the people? He gave them to his cronies, and the few people that he did give them to, he made sure they didn't have the inputs or credit so they could take loans, made them dependent on him while using nationalist rhetoric. This is just a playbook, and the last thing I will say, he ruined the economy. They went to hyperinflation. We all remember 1,000, 6,000, 60 trillion% inflation. Some of you may have seen those huge bills that they had, a barter economy.
I still have a pile of them at home.
We have a painting in our house. So there are parallels. There are parallels.
You touched on an important point, and again, as with Eric, I'd like to return to this idea of one of the autocrats' playbooks is this idea of the ruination of the economy, and it kind of defies logic in some ways. So I'd like us to try to hash that one out. Jon, again, you've been in a lot of places. DCM in Mexico, you served in Dominican Republic and Colombia. Before that, you were a Marine helicopter pilot in the Middle East, one of these people who's had an interesting career. And finally, ambassador to Panama, which is where we met. And Jon has the, I think, honor and distinction of having been one of the more senior diplomats of this country to have resigned in opposition to Donald Trump following the racism that became in evidence at Charlottesville and Trump's everybody's fine kind of added in a response to that. What are you seeing? I mean, obviously we're all aware of Panama again today because in Trump's inaugural speech, I think he mentioned it 3 times and essentially said, screw the treaty, we're taking it back kind of thing. But you're here to talk about another country, neighboring, very near to Panama, Nicaragua, which is a country you've known over the years. Jon has had a lot of oversight in Latin America. What do you, again, I think it's slightly mystifying because Daniel Ortega starts out as a revolutionary figure in the Marxist era, the Cold War. Reagan stepped up the Contras against him. He lost power in elections. He actually did stand for elections, lost them, and had to spend 16 years in the political wilderness. By hook or by crook, stayed in the political firmament, came back, stood for elections, won them, and here we are 19 years later. And he is about as close to a a Khan from the Middle Ages as you can find in this hemisphere. Yeah,
I think actually Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, who is his wife, who is now coming back to our checklist, changed the Constitution. The Nicaraguans, he and his cronies who were stacked in the assembly, changed the Constitution so that there is now a co-president that is enshrined in Nicaragua's new Constitution, and that co-president is his wife. So check that box. The other thing you mentioned at the beginning that I think is very important is this idea of otherizing your opposition to the point of where you criminalize your opposition. And some people may recall that 2 years ago, 222 Nicaraguans who were all political prisoners were flown out of Nicaragua, a horrible prison. They were held in several, but the one that's very well known is at Chipote. And these are medieval dungeon conditions, right? They're flown out. It was a Foreign Service officer, Kevin Sullivan, who was keeping the lights on in our embassy in Managua, who dealt directly with the wife of the president. She wasn't the co-president at that point, but she was pretty damn powerful. And she called him up and said, you guys in America are always talking about how much you like Democrats. Well, I'm ready to give you 222 of them. And we're going to start with 3 days. We're joined today by my good friend Brian Nichols, who was the assistant secretary at that time. That operation was held about this tight. Nobody knew until they were in the air. Nothing leaked. And when they got in the air, they were met by a woman named Martha Yu, also a career Foreign Service officer. And her words to them were, welcome to freedom.
Yeah.
This is what we risk losing when an apolitical career Foreign Service, career federal employee, wherever, is under threat as it is today. And I'll just leave you with the words of one of the passengers on that plane, a fellow by the name of Felix Madariaga. Felix is a very charismatic Nicaraguan man. He and his family actually had to flee the Somoza regime earlier. He was raised partially in Texas. He gets his education in the States. He goes back to Nicaragua, and he's a presidential candidate. He, along with every other presidential candidate, is locked up. He is thrown in jail. He's on that plane, and his words to me, and I think he's probably written them too, are autocracy is a lot like a virus. When you get an infection from a virus, if the body's autoimmune system automatically kicks in, you're probably going to be okay. But if your body's autoimmune system doesn't pick up the virus or the infection, by the time you show symptoms, it's probably too late. That's why we're here today, Jon Lee and my colleagues. That's why you're all here. This kind of event, nonviolent, respectful, apolitical, is about the autoimmune system of a democracy, the guardrails of democracy, which are enshrined in our Constitution, the freedom of assembly and the freedom of speech.
Thanks, John. Like you, I know a number of Nicaraguans, and it's a country I've been to over the years, including in its years of conflict. And one of the things I noticed, and I wonder if you have thoughts about that when we come back to you, is, why nobody saw it coming. It includes a man I admire a great deal, Sergio Ramirez, a novelist, and he both served in the first junta, in the Carter years, and then eventually broke with Daniel, but had no idea that it would get to this point where he and others would literally not only be forced out of the country, he was one step ahead of the arrest, but they've literally been stripped of their property, their nationality, and even their academic credentials. And interesting, because you see kind of glimmerings of that happening here almost, don't you? I wonder, anyway. Thanks. And Maria Yovanovitch, Masha, you have served, like Erica, much of your career in the Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine twice. You were there in the period both as ambassador recently. I think most of us recognize you for that, and how Trump in his first presidency forced you to leave, and in actions that led to his first impeachment. But you were also there at an earlier period when in that kind of uneven road towards democracy that the Ukrainians had after they became an independent state, with the guarantees from the major powers, including Russia, that their democracy would be protected. We saw a Russian-backed character try to turn back the clock in the country. And you were there when the citizens of that country found it in themselves to rescue that democracy. Despite the fact that it's been under attack since, they actually achieved something, didn't they? And maybe that's something you can tell us, because we also want, I think we're looking here for, paths that leave us some reason for hope. And I think Masha's experience and her observations of what happened in Ukraine, the civic awareness and the civic spirit of that country before the current war might be instructive.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody for coming today and our online audience as well. Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Yeah. Okay.
Just hold it closer if you
Hold
can.
it closer. Okay. Remind me
There
about
you go.
that.
Okay.
Remind me about that. Yeah, so this is pretty depressing, what we're hearing, what we're seeing here in our own country. And so I thought that what I wanted to talk about was how the Ukrainians have inspired me. And everybody in this room knows what happened after 2022 when the Russians reinvaded Ukraine and every Ukrainian stood up and said no and united and fought back. But they've been doing that all along since independence, because unlike our country, they came from a very different place. A communist, first the Russian Empire, then communism, and didn't have, the same kind of civil society that we've had since the very founding and even before of our nation. They didn't have that tradition and that tradition of democracy. But there are a number of things that they did over time, and I'll just tick through them, and then perhaps we can go into detail at a later time. But I think the first thing is that the Ukrainians said, if not me, who? It is up to me to make my country what I want it to be. And I think about our own country, where the Constitution starts with, the simple words, we the people, right? It's about us. It's not, the executive branch that instituted the Constitution and this country. It's we the people. This is our country, and we need to act. And we have a long and proud tradition of having a very strong civil society. And I think the good news is we are seeing it kick in now. Ukrainians thought big, they thought bold. Back in the 1990s, the early 2000s, who thought that Ukraine could become a member of NATO, become a member of the EU? They still aren't, but it's no longer the crazy idea that people thought it was back then. And yet, in the early 2000s and on through the years, Ukrainians worked towards that goal, because the thing about big thoughts is you can affect reality. You can make it reality if you want it to. Has anybody heard about Project 2025? Well, there's good news, there's bad news, and then there's good news that we can affect our own reality by thinking big thoughts about what we want to do. So think big, be bold, speak out. Stories are powerful. I mean, think about the stories you've heard on this stage. Think about the stories you've heard about what has happened in Ukraine, in the United States, about how bad policies affect lives. I mean, not just countries, but lives. This is powerful. And when people hear those individual stories, minds are changed, and then actions take place. And so there's a continuum. So speak out, and then act now. Again, be bold. Ukrainians didn't wait for the perfect moment for a revolution or a change of leadership or something else. They were drafting legislation, they were setting up NGOs, they were doing all the things they could do, setting up independent media. They were doing all the things they could do, waiting for that moment to come. And when the moment came, they were ready. We need to be ready. We need to consolidate all of that. And the final point I would say is, we need to build community. We need to unite. We need to act together. That gives us courage, number one. It gives us efficacy, and it allows us to protect the most vulnerable in our communities, because the playbook, as we've seen, and the playbook here, is to go after the most vulnerable. And we need to have community as our shield for the most vulnerable and also for the rest of us. The last thing I would say is that we need to keep on going. Change is slow, and then it happens really quickly.
Thanks, Masha. I think, I'm just a quick aside that I live in the UK and travel a lot. And one of the things I've been hearing from people these past 99 days is, what are the Americans doing? Where are the intellectuals? Where is where are the demonstrations? What's the Democratic Party doing? I was with Lula not too long ago, and he said, "Where's Obama? He's young." He was saying, "What's happening?" I think, and I've been thinking about that because, of course, for the past 2 or 3 weeks, especially, we've all read or seen, perhaps depending on where you live, that in fact there are protests now starting. You have the barnstorming of, Teresa Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie, which apparently draws big crowds. There have been, now we see the universities beginning to fight back after an initial a period of submission almost. But what I think is that the shock and awe of those, what does Bannon call it? Burn it down.
Muzzle velocity.
Yeah. Of what they've done was well planned. It took everybody by surprise, the degree of it, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things a day. And there's a sense of cognitive dissonance. You expect a kind of commensurate response, and it's just not there yet, but it's begun. So I would be curious to hear you, Masha, speaking about this in light of, of what we're seeing in the States. Is this period maybe analogous, when I come back to you, is this period maybe analogous to something you saw in Ukraine? And did it involve, did it require charismatic leaders, or was it quiet collective community civic action? Was it clandestine cells? What's needed?
All of the above?
All of that above, yeah. It's funny, some of those 60s groups no longer with us came to mind just then. Eric, back to you. I'd like to, I left you there on that cliffhanger of Putin about to take over Russia. Please carry on and tell us, how he did it and, what the parallels are with this fellow we now have in the White House.
Well, I think, you were talking about Sergio Ramirez and his inability to believe that his old friend Danny could do what he did. I think we have to be very careful about what I would call a failure of negative imagination, which comes from our American native optimism. And I want that optimism. We need it because it's what's going to carry us through. And I used to criticize my Eastern European friends because they were always so negative and so down. The official position in Eastern Europe is things could be a lot worse, and they definitely will be soon. And, that's not us. That's not America. But I will say, be very afraid and be ready to accept. So, for example, what did Putin do right away? He and his pals from the former KGB blew up a couple of apartment buildings with people living in them. And that was intended to create a state of emergency so that they could then curtail civil liberties right up front. And they blew up, 150 people, babies and everyone included. And people said, well, that couldn't be. I mean, they couldn't do such a horrible, immoral thing. Well, they did. And so one of the things I'll say, God forbid, but if we wake up one morning and you hear about something really terrible, please don't say there must be an innocent explanation. Please don't say in our country things like this are not intentional. I hope not. But this is the playbook.
Maybe we're seeing a softer version of it with the deportation of, U.S. citizens. However soft-pedaled or, Abrego Garcia, I think his name is, or the 2 kids that were just deported along with their mother. Fear has started. Again, everyone I know in Europe is afraid to come to this country now. I was reading a statistic on my way here day before yesterday that the country, that 12%, it's had 12% less foreign travelers visiting than this time last year. That's significant, and I'll bet you anything it will continue. People I know, journalists I know from other countries, were telling me, "Have you seen the what was it, CPJ or one of the NGOs is sharing an instruction guide on what to do with your phone." And I got off the plane at Dulles on a flight from Amsterdam, and it was middle afternoon. Everything was quiet. I was lucky. I mean, I'm an American citizen. But having said that, I've had run-ins with immigration in this country too. Just bad-tempered guys, usually. It didn't happen this time. the guy saw that my original flight had left Barcelona. He said, Madrid, they beat Madrid, didn't they? In the football game. And I said, yeah. I don't know anything about soccer, but I said, yeah. And he said, cool, welcome back. But otherwise, who knows what would have happened. And
can I just say one other
please.
thing? I mean, our friends and allies in Western Europe, those governments are issuing travel warnings about the United States. I mean, whoever could have imagined that? I mean, going back to Eric's point about a failure of imagination.
Right. And in Latin America, I still stay very well plugged in Latin America and with a lot of journalists. There are literally manuals that are being circulated what to do when you travel into Miami. And it includes things like blitz your phone.
Yeah.
Bring a burner.
Bring a burner.
Make sure that you've got 2 copies of your passport and one that you mail ahead to somebody who can call a lawyer. These are people who are coming in legally. Now, the other thing I will say is keep in mind as well, those ICE and CBP people at the airport, there are a lot of them who are conflicted.
Sure.
I know a lot of them. And what I'm hearing is the same thing that I saw in Nicaragua. The federal bureaucracy, or there it was, the national police bureaucracy, is always in the early days of an autocratic creeping takeover, is always conflicted. And they have family members who are affected. They have neighbors who are affected by the increasing cutting off of liberties, et cetera. And yet, because they have very real reasons for staying in there, it's a job, number one. Many of them have been there for a long time. Same thing that's happening to our CBP people. And therein lies the inherent cruelty of any autocracy. It takes the very people who work for the state and turns them against the people of the state. And that is something I see happening. I've seen it in Nicaragua, I've seen it in Venezuela, I've seen it in Cuba, and my colleagues who've worked in other autocracies and dictatorships have seen it there. And we need to keep in mind, this is happening here as we speak.
Yeah. Harry, I wanted to come back to you on this idea of the economic destruction of countries that are taken over by tyrants. And we did see this with Mugabe. And again, you wonder how, why people continue to support, despite the fact that they live in penury. We've seen it again and again in different places. And here, of course, we're in the midst of a kind of bizarre, chaotic tariffs war declared by Trump on the entire world. And some days he adds new ones, other days he withdraws them, lowers percentages. There's a kind of caprice to what he's doing. And of course, most of us know as well that some of these, if these tariffs remain in place, they're going to directly affect adversely American workers, his constituents. And yet, until now, those constituents they're as shocked and awed as perhaps as Democrats are. I've heard from, in different areas, different constituencies, making excuses or even saying that maybe it'll work out in the long run. There's this kind of suspension of belief. Was it something like that as well in Mugabe, in Zimbabwe?
Yes.
Why would anybody have continued to support this man if he had arguably absolutely destroyed the agriculture in the country and the economy of the country?
Because some people were able to enrich themselves. Others were part of his tribe, who he took care of. Others were cowered in fear. There were people, young people. I used to have a council of university graduates, and young people came to see me once, and they did as our kids do, posted on social media. I was only 3 months in the country. All of those people got called into the American-trained minister's office and had their contracts canceled. So the message was, you speak to the Americans, we're going to cancel your contracts, harm your way of living. That resonated with people. They understood that their way of life could be harmed. But if you went along, maybe you worked for Coke, you may work for a government parastatal, maybe they bought your agriculture. culture, but also your identity was up in the tribalism. And we condemn tribalism as we should, but we have racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-immigration parts in our nation also.
Isn't MAGA a tribe?
That's
Sort of.
Yes, but in so many cases. So you see that. Again, it will change or may change in our country when people's pockets are hurt.
Yeah.
And we're on a lag, in my opinion. But I live in Florida. I love to golf. I love to smoke cigars and drink bourbon.
You're in the right place.
That's what
It
got him
it is perfect. But we complain in Florida because from November to March, we have a lot of people coming from UK and Canada. Our golf courses, our restaurants, our cigar bars are crowded. Not this year. Not this year. The Airbnbs down. Everything, because our Canadian allies and partners are not coming. Our UK allies and partners are not coming. The same thing happened in Zimbabwe. As Ambassador Nichols can tell you, it was a place for tourism. 50,000 Americans a year go to Victoria Falls. A lot of people in Southern Africa, because of the infrastructure, went to Victoria Falls. When that infrastructure collapsed, when you couldn't get money, when you weren't sure you were going to be safe, tourism went down, not only in Victoria Falls, but in other places, especially the game parks that attracted people. So to me, there are many, many parallels.
That's something that's sort of bubbling up in all of your soliloquies is also this idea of the community that is vilified. The other. In the case of Zimbabwe, I was thinking it was it was the white farmers, of course.
It was the white farmers, but it was also the Ndebelés. Remember, he murdered the Ndebelés.
That's right.
Because he wanted one-party rule.
That was Nkomo, right? Yeah.
That's right, Joshua
And the
Nkomo.
United States and the UK ignored that in the early 80s because they wanted him to help get South Africa's independence.
Yeah.
And against apartheid. He turned out to be a far different figure than Mandela. I think the last thing I'll say on this, when I got there first in '89, I went to Matabele land, and people took me out to the areas where you could see skeletons of bodies coming through the ground. But what was the United States' later response? We built the Martin Luther King Jr. Library. We helped rebuild a university out there. So we looked at something and said, we're going to do better. We're going to help people through human rights and education coming out of a tragedy.
If it was the Ndebele and the white farmers in Zimbabwe, it was the Chechens and then NATO expansion for Putin. And in Nicaragua, it's the Catholic Church, right? As well as any opposition figure. And in the case of Ukraine, again, it was Trojan horses for NATO, right? The wrong sorts of oligarchs. The West. Yeah, the West. Eric.
Well, I think fear is really the word that we need to focus on here. And we were just talking about how terrible it is that if you're a European or an African or nation and you come to Dulles and you go through immigration, that you might have trouble. But guess what? All of us, every single person in this room, you can arrive at the port of entry and they can say, I want to see your phone and your laptop and I want your password. If you're an American citizen, you can refuse to give them your passwords and they are required to let you into your own country, but they can seize your devices for a certain amount of time and try to copy whatever you have. That's bad enough if it's random. And I personally think that's a violation of our rights as American citizens, and I don't accept the law that says they can do that. It's not something traditionally that has been done very often. What if you're on a blacklist because you're opposed to the policies of the President of the United States, and you can no longer come into this country at a port of entry without facing harassment and having your devices seized. That's what these autocracies look like. We are so close to that right now. And CBP is working for the White House. There is no doubt, I agree, that a lot of the officers at CBP and ICE are good, patriotic people who believe in the rule of law. But at the end of the day, I'm sorry to say this, but cops act like cops. And if you say to them, do whatever you want, you're in charge, you're going to have a police state. And so how far are we from any of us in this room having our laptops seized at Dulles because we're on a blacklist because we're critics of the administration? I think we're almost there. We're just about almost there. And it's scary. So fear works up to a point until people say, as they did in Ukraine, no, you're trying to scare me, but I say no. I'm not going to be scared. It's tough, but I think that's the essence of what we're talking about.
Well, if they get my laptop, they're going to find a lot of New York Mets baseball statistics on it. So not that they're welcome to it, because I agree completely. I want to shift a little bit, though, and I want to talk about a quality of autocracies and dictatorships that we've mentioned briefly, but we haven't delved into, but I think it's something that's really worth looking at. And that is nepotism and cronyism. If you look at Nicaragua, it is the closest thing you will find outside of Pyongyang to a North Korean-style absolute dictatorship. Right here in our hemisphere. Because it's small, because it's poor, we don't give it a lot of attention. But we should right now be looking at Nicaragua and looking at the Ortega Murillo regime, because they're always set in one fell swoop, which is a little bit different here because Donald Trump doesn't shed a limelight with anybody. But let's look at the Melania NFT. Let's look at the Donald Trump coin. Let's look at the way in which the Trump administration has begun to commercialize itself. Let's take a look at who's getting contracts. Let's take a look at where federal money is flowing to build the detention camps that ICE is going to need to pick up all of those folks. This is all cronyism. In Nicaragua, the exact same thing happened. Not all at once, as Masha said earlier. Sometimes this happens slowly over time, and it's kind of like the frogs in tepid water. You know, you don't realize when you're boiling, or that virus from my friend, you know, by the time you've got symptoms, hey, you're already in a full-blown autocracy. So right now, today in Nicaragua, the Ortega Murillo regime literally controls every single sector of the economy. And they let some very wealthy oligarchs make money too. But anytime those oligarchs' interests might conflict with theirs, they're expendable. And they whack them. And I think we're going to see Elon Musk get whacked here pretty soon. The idea here is to call this out. The ethics rules that guide public service in the executive branch or the legislative branch have so long since been blown through by the Trump administration. But look to Mugabe. Look to the way Putin cronies. Anybody remember the Panama Papers? They were all linked to Vladimir Putin and his cronies, his cello player, his chef. Same thing happened in Nicaragua. Happens today. The Sun is in charge of all the TV stations. He's the new media mogul. They shut down La Prensa. They shut down all of the people who were on that flight a couple of years ago, were the publishers. Juan Lorenzo, you know him, Jon Lee, a number of people here know him. That is what I really think we need to keep an eye on, and for a real good reason. Because Americans, by and large, reject nepotism. It's not that uncommon in the cultures of Latin America. It's sort of expected, and especially in a tribal country, you're going to take care of your peeps. But in the United States, we don't like nepotism. We generally have an antibody to it in our system. So keep an eye on that, and we need to call it out when we see it.
You know, but you say that, John. I didn't think I would, disagree so early on. But
Go right ahead.
Donald Nixon. Ray Clinton, was it his brother-in-law? I remember, while Clinton was in the office, wasn't he touring North Korea as a country western? No, that was Carter, Billy Carter,
Billy
with the
Carter.
belly flop contests and the beer. But yeah, you know, nepotism of different sorts are kind of part and parcel of the political.
How about Hunter Biden
Yeah.
flying around and being invited to state dinners? And I grant you that we have small examples, but we're talking about scale. None of those presidential family members ever ran entire mining sectors like they do in Nicaragua.
It's very similar to what we saw going back to the Arab Spring and that era in the Middle East, late 90s, early 2000s. It was what the you know, that last generation of secular nationalist big men, whether it was Mubarak or Saddam or Gaddafi and Assad, were all doing. They were handing off power to one or another son, or if they had a number of them, and they were apportioning parts of the economy to them. What Ortega has done in Nicaragua is exactly what Gaddafi was doing in the lead up to the revolution. Every son got some sector. One got shipping, one got gold, one got oil, one got whatever. But
there's a really good reason for that, because autocrats inspire distrust, enmity. They're always stepping on someone else's toes. The family and the close-in lifelong friends are the only people you can really trust. Everybody else's loyalty is bought, cajoled, extortion into existence. Your family is the last vestige of your protection as an autocrat.
Masha, all of these.
I'm just
yes.
going to say one thing about this. So when I was in Kyrgyzstan, a small, former Soviet republic, which is now an independent state, I got there shortly after the revolution that they had in 2005, and the president, newly elected President Bakiyev, who had been part of the democratic opposition, was on the street. Everybody, he came in a landslide. People were sure that this was going to be great. All sorts of democratic reform would ensue. And the first thing he did was put all of his brothers and his sons in charge of every important job in the country. So they had the family had the whole thing locked up. And, within a month, people were saying, next time, we're going to elect somebody with fewer brothers. So, I mean, there is a game plan.
And going back to Ukraine, I mean, we always hear about corruption in Ukraine, and of course, it's a kind of it's a bully boy stick used by Kyiv's enemies. Having the temerity to throw the first stone from Moscow is really something, but we see it all the time. Nonetheless, that was a problem, right? It was a problem in their road to democracy. I remember in the 90s. How did you see that overcome, or was it? And again, back to my earlier question, in this kind of forward-looking part of this conversation, how did they organize? Did it require charismatic leaders, or was it, as we've seen in so many other places where things start to happen, just simply about a kind of groundswell and like-minded people getting together, being careful, but being assertive? What did you see? It's a double-sided question. The corruption on the one hand and the organization on the other. Again, we're looking for examples here, we're looking for strands of hope. Yeah.
So on the corruption issue, so pretty much all of the countries of the former Soviet Union, were corrupt because they, the newly independent states, because they inherited the system from the Soviet era. It was the same leaders who, said that they wanted to be democratic and they wanted a market economy. They had no idea what that meant or how to get there, but they said that because they knew that was the flavor of the day. And it was, the same old, and they didn't want to change anything because it worked for them, right? The Soviet Union had been corrupt. The pipelines were still coming to them. They liked that. And so it took a while, I think, in every country for the people to kind of realize what was going on and that there actually is a different way of living. It doesn't have to be like this. And I think Ukraine, with its history of, independence and struggling against the Russians going back to the Sich and independent communities in the east of Ukraine is an example of one of the countries that has been most successful in that, which isn't to say there isn't still an issue. I mean, there is corruption in every country. What matters is how you deal with it. And the reason that many people feel that, you know, Ukraine's corruption is like up here and Russia's is, I don't know, someplace here and other countries are lower, is because of the Ukrainian people. Because the Ukrainian people in 2014 said, enough. We don't want to live this way anymore, and we want to stop this. And so it became very public. And there was, you know, kind of, you know, the people of civil society, the reformers that came in with the new government, and the international community all worked together to start trying to get a handle around it. But 2014, that was 11 years ago. You know, it takes a while for things to change. And, you know, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's very hard because there are vested interests, and
Sure.
they remain.
And as to the organization that helped,
Yeah.
you know, get rid of Yovanovitch and
Yeah. So I wouldn't, and I know there are some Ukrainians in the room and you can jump up and disagree with me. I'm not sure I would actually call it an organization in the beginning. But there were many groups that established themselves over the years to do what they were most passionate about: the environment, children's education, helping the community mayor, you know, do certain tasks, whatever it was. And civil society was forming in Ukraine, where, you know, the history in that part of the world was if anybody took any initiative outside of the Communist Party, you were punished. And so there wasn't a lot of initiative in the beginning. But, you know, people got that bug. They understood that, and they, you know, heralded back to their history of several centuries ago, and even the sort of the fighting during World War II, where, you know, there were partisans, you know, long after World War II had ended in the woods, fighting on for Ukraine. So, you know, this is a proud people, and they, everybody did their own thing. But then in 2013, when Yovanovitch turned his back on the European Union, and we can talk about that later if anybody's interested, a bunch of students got together and they protested in November, December of 2013. And Yovanovitch brought out the police, and he beat them brutally and threw some of them in jail. And the people kind of, you know, an independent journalist put on Facebook, what are they doing to our kids? We need to go out and support them. And that's how it started. And then, you know, by February, there were, you know, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, sometimes 1 million people on the streets, not just in Kyiv, not just the capital city, but all over Ukraine. It had gotten to be too much. And it was because Yovanovitch had not just turned his back on the European Union, he had extinguished the hope of every parent, of every student who wanted to study in Europe, who wanted to work in Europe, people who wanted to do business in Europe, and parents wanted that for their children. And so they were going to be out there supporting their kids. And I don't think it was, I mean, yes, there were charismatic leaders, perhaps too many of them fighting with each other.
Yeah.
And in the end, actually, the people in the streets had, I think, more control than the leaders. But I think the point was that at a, you know, in January, February, the Ukrainians decided, you know, not because somebody told them, not because there was a discussion about it, but, you know, this is the moment. We need to act together. We need to put our differences aside because this is about our freedom. And if we lose our freedom, forget about it. We don't have anything else. And they felt that passionately. And business also supported them. So people did different things. Business people quietly supported, because you can't have hundreds of thousands of people on the street without food, without medical assistance, without all of the things that a community requires, right? And so business supported, including some of the oligarchs, quietly. And so it was an all-of-nation effort, and people did what they could. People with medical training became the medics, so for example. But it wasn't totally organized from the start.
One of the things I've been musing about lately is whether the fact that the U.S. is such a prosperous country and the kind of general level of comfort, material comfort, is so high compared to so much of the rest of the world that, you know, people that otherwise might I don't know, risk losing their jobs or livelihoods or go out on the streets don't do so out of a fear because they have a lot to lose or they feel they have a lot to lose. And I wonder if that is one of the differences with kind of more lean societies where very often the risk is greater. It could be mortal, you know, they could get killed, but there is no fat, there is no comfort, there's no cushion that allows them to think, well, you know, I might lose my car, I might lose my house, I won't be able to send my daughter to the second year of university, that sort of stuff. It's just a kind of open question that I have about America, really the West today, you know, the democratic West, which is, of course, the most affluent part of the world. And the other, it's sort of an A and B musing, is about social media. Not only its incredible impact, in my mind, toxic on what we call democracy, democratic society, by the way messaging is able to capture people's imaginations, deform ideas, spread contagion, and win elections, and also turn science and fact around. You know, this is something we're seeing across the world now, and social media is the trigger for a lot of it. But having listened to you about that period in Ukrainian life, I was remembering that in 2011, there was that one moment in Russia when hundreds of thousands of people went out on the streets of Moscow and protested. What happened?
So, you know, fear is a continuum, and it's a continuum here. It was very definitely a continuum in Russia. Long before 2011, people understood that if they opposed the regime, there would be consequences potentially, and there were consequences. But what happened was the first time that you really had large numbers of Russians out in the streets, and not only Russians, but they were urban, educated Russians. And, you know, societies do distinguish between influential people and people they don't care about, which is why Russia right now is sending, you know, poor kids from ethnic minorities from the provinces and prisoners from the prisons, rather than, you know, kids from Moscow and St. Petersburg and elsewhere who they're not sending to fight in Ukraine. But the fear that happened then was a two-way street. The regime got scared because they had tens of thousands. I think at one point it was 250,000 people on the street, essentially saying we're not going to put up with this anymore. And it was make or break for the regime. And the regime, you know, just decided to deploy all their tools of fear and repression, and they beat people and they dragged people to prison. And truth be told, very few people got long sentences from those demonstrations, but the fear was instilled. And then since then, it has been ratcheted up to the point where, you know, it's almost as bad. It's not as bad as Stalin's time because people generally are not murdered for dissent, although it happens. A lot of people fall out of windows in Russia, much higher rate than anywhere else in the world. But you can go to, you know, prison camp for 15 years for an ill-advised comment. And so the fear there is very strong. And, you know, we're seeing it here. I mean, I will just share, I had a friend who just told me that he was fired because his employer got a denunciation from another employee that he was very active in social media politically and was active in anti-Trump social media. And the employer said, we can't have that. That's bad for business. You're going to get us all in trouble. You're fired. Denunciation from a fellow coworker, non-governmental, this was private sector. The fear is already there. And if you look at the Russian model, you know, it doesn't take that much. Most people will back off if they're going to lose their livelihood. Their kids are going to, I mean, one of the things the Russians do is to say it'd be a real shame if your kid got drafted and got sent to fight in Ukraine. So maybe you should stop protesting because that could happen. They even did that to our Russian employees at the US Embassy. If they were unhappy with them, they would draft their kids. So that kind of thing is real. But I would just argue we're already there.
Yeah.
So what we saw in those days at the universities, in the media. I see signs of that already here.
Well, yeah, I mean, the punishment's being meted out as we speak. The judge that was arrested the other day, these the people that have been deported, the phones being examined at the border. It's a pretty repressive atmosphere. We're getting close to the end of our 90 minutes, but I wanted to just throw a question to each of you about that might come from the other side of the aisle. Or I don't know if there's any kind of doubting Thomases out there in the audience, but but really, here you are. You're all card-carrying members of the deep state. You're Democrats. You hate. You're Trump haters. What does he call them? Trump something?
No,
Never
we are
Trumpers.
failed globalists.
There you go. Failed globalists.
I'm going to get T-shirts made. Failed globalist.
I've thought of a few T-shirts that would definitely get me arrested. So yeah, isn't this a partisan agenda? I mean, what do you say to the people? And by the way, and I know that probably all of us have had these moments. I've had a couple recently, and not only here in this country, of people coming up, and I think genuinely they, you could say, swallowed the Kool-Aid, or they're hearing things in their own countries. Because by the way, this process is being emulated and cloned. I've been in Argentina, El Salvador, Brazil. There are people who are following this agenda, and there are, of course, wannabe autocrats who are actively and consciously trying to follow the playbook. And in some cases, they're doing it with success. And I'm just talking about this hemisphere. What do you say to those people? I mean, I don't know. Do you have a cousin or a brother-in-law or someone who's a Republican, and can you still talk to them? And what do you say to them when they say you're just part of the deep state?
There's always one or two, right?
Exactly. So how do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, we say we love our nation just as they do. We've served our nation. We've served presidents, Democratic and Republican. When I worked at the White House, I worked for Dr. Rice. She never asked what party I was. Nobody overseas asked what party I was. So I would tell relatives or friends, as many where I live in Florida are still supporters of President Trump, that we love our democracy. We want to see it continue. And that I think criticizing a president is part of democracy. Nonviolent criticism is part of democracy. My mother was there with Eric's mother, didn't know it in August 1963. But a last thing I would like to say is that in November 2017, when Mugabe's government was ending, the military was about to take over. And they allowed the first march since the Pope came many years ago. And Zimbabweans of every stripe, tribe or not, race or not, they all, the Asians, the Indians, whites, all went out into the street. And they were marching for freedom. And the Russian embassy was right next to ours. And when they passed by our embassy, they all chanted USA, USA. And that was because we stood for democracy, for human rights, for gay rights, for students. So when we do that, our values are respected. People cheer us. When we don't do that, they will curse us for generations.
Yeah. Eric.
I was just going to say, I think the phrase you were looking for was Trump derangement syndrome.
That's it. Yeah.
And I reject that. I do have one aunt and her husband who are on the spectrum, I would say. And we keep our relationship because it's important. Now, do I have a lot of friends who are on the spectrum? No, I don't. But I think, we do have, Harry's absolutely right. It has to be about who we are and what we believe in. I think the positive approach is more effective. Sometimes I find what people call the MSNBC syndrome, just the constant drumbeat of criticism. All the criticism is valid, in my opinion. It's very rarely wrong, but that's not going to win you arguments at the end of the day. And so, trying to identify what it is that we're selling, frankly, and what we're selling is our country and what it stands for. That's where I try to come out. But I do come back to this. Just be aware of that fear mongering that is intended to get us all to back off. I can't tell you how many friends, and there are probably people in this room, I've gotten notes from people saying, don't send me stuff like that on Gmail. We have to use Signal. Now, first of all, we know that Signal is not secure. I hope everybody knows that. It is not. But my first reaction was, whoa, wait a minute. We're Americans. You're saying, and these are not like even active duty people. These are like retired U.S. government people. And they're saying they're afraid to send me a note on Gmail. My initial reaction to that is, ouch, that's terrible. But guess what? It's where we are. But not letting that fear deter us from standing up for who we are and what we need to do, I think that's really important.
John.
I would say that, unlike Eric, I do have a number of people who are strong MAGA supporters. And the reason for that is because you mentioned at the beginning, I started my professional career in public service as a Marine Corps officer. And for over 30 odd years, I was part of the evolving technology, right? We started with, Yahoo, and then it was email, and then we went to WhatsApp, and then they didn't like what's his name? The guy who's in charge of Meta. Thank you. And so now they're on Signal, and the high irony is that, they can find out the attack plans on Signal. But when they went to Signal after about, 7 or 8 years of us all being on the WhatsApp group, and of about 25 individuals, and they were all men, only 3 of us were not Trump supporters. And we would fight, as the Marines do, which means it's politically incorrect, which means it's no holds barred, etc. But they went to Signal, and we got voted off the island. They left us behind. That happened about a year and a half ago. And in my case, individually, just about every one of them came back to me in a one-on-one. They're not at all relentless or repentant about their political beliefs, but they all came back, and I am able to communicate with them only one-on-one, only on a proton email, because they don't want to see that it's coming from a deep stater. But the issue there, and what I would say, and what I say to every one of these guys is, we all only serve one flag. It's that flag back there. It's the one Harry's got on his pin. It's the one I'm wearing today. And that is really important, because in the heat of the MSNBC versus Fox 4 moment, we risk losing that. And I believe that the administration and individuals in the administration, the Steve Bannons and the Steve Millers of the world, who are very bright and very skilled and know how to use all the social media, are firing with a muzzle velocity to purposely keep that gap open, so that my Marine brothers won't talk to me even in a one-on-one. And there are a couple of them who just, I think they've written me off as somebody in the deep state, and they'll come visit me in prison one day. But the most important thing is to remember, there's only one flag. E pluribus unum. We have to keep that in mind. So those people represent 1.3% more than voted for the other candidate last time. I look at what I'm doing now, and I look at the struggle ahead, not as a partisan struggle between Republicans and large D Democrats. I look at it as a struggle between people who believe in the fundamental small d democracy represented by that flag.
Thanks, John. Masha, how about you?
So I will take a slightly different tack, and I'll say that, as you all discussed, I think many of us, certainly myself, are overwhelmed by the velocity of what is happening and the ferocity of it. And I think some of us wonder what we can do. There's just so many areas of attack out there. There's so many things that are going on. what could I possibly do to make a difference? And I think again, going back to the Ukrainian experience, there are so many things that people can do. Everybody doesn't have to do everything. You have to do one thing. Just the one thing that perhaps you care about the most, or that you're most passionate about, or that you see in your neighborhood needs to get done. And so I'll give you some examples. If what you're concerned about is migrants and people who have requested amnesty and things like that, there are a lot of very risky things that you could do. There are also things like volunteering to deliver food, providing legal assistance if you're a lawyer. There's a whole list of things you can do. If you're concerned about our elections, and there's a Virginia gubernatorial election coming up this November that is going to be critical, and you want to make sure that people get out and vote, you can do door knocking. You can also do things like help American citizens get the documents they need so that they can register to vote, so that they can actually vote. It is a multi-step system, and there are people in this country, it's unbelievable, but there are people in this country that don't have the $25 to pay for the birth certificate for their newborn child. And you can help those people. You don't need, you would be trained up, but you don't need special skills. There are churches that do that mission. You don't have to belong to that church. There's so many different areas where people, can work. It's what you think is the most important to you, and that you feel you can do. It's in your comfort zone, although there may come a time when we work outside of our comfort zones. And the last thing I would say is, you may be sitting here and saying, I'm an introvert, I don't want to do any of those things. That's me. I would be happiest sitting in my house reading a book. But you know what? If you love books, if you love your public library, go and talk to your librarian and find out what you can do to support him or her to keep Maya Angelou and Mein Kampf on the shelves. We need not only adults who are critical thinkers, but kids who are critical thinkers. That is, I think, the most important thing of keeping our democracy safe and continuing into the future. So I'll stop there, but I could go on.
I like that, Masha. Thank you. Yeah. Is that Maria Habib leaving? So good to see you. My God, it's been ages. It's amazing. I'll just say, adding to what you just said, Masha, it really can't be improved upon, but just that I've had an instinct for some time, and it's still not a very fully formed idea, but that, again, these things, this social media, the virtual lives that we increasingly live, hold us also at a significant distance from one another, and the physical expression of our ideas and our points of view, I think, has been profoundly shouldered aside, in this past 20 years. And I think we have to get out there and get in people's faces in a good way. Talk across the aisle. Try to use the same sort of hustings that politicians have monopolized for years. As journalists, if we're only preaching to the convinced in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or the New York Times or whatever, or MSNBC or whatever we're working for, if these people continue to look at us and say, you're just an agent of the deep state, you're peddling lies, we have to actually think of something new. A new way to get to these people, a way to get them to listen to us and to convince them that we're not that, the horned creature. And the only thing I've been able to think of is actually talking in forums like this. But it should be forums in all kinds of places, out of our comfort zone, if possible, with all of the risks that entails, getting eggs thrown at you or whatever. Anyway, and that's my little 2 cents. But we need to do more of this. And so thank you all very, very much. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Busboys and Poets.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. It's been great.